Decorated war veteran Malcolm King has always believed in honor, integrity, and the power of justice. But when his teenage son, Jordan, falls victim to a brutal assault by a racist police officer, Malcolm's world is shattered. Left clinging to life in a hospital bed, Jordan becomes a symbol of a broken system, a system that refuses to hold its own accountable. Officer Wyatt Blake is untouchable, shielded by a corrupt department willing to go to any lengths to protect its reputation. With lies and cover-ups mounting, Malcolm finds himself isolated, facing down a network of power and prejudice determined to silence him. As Malcolm battles for justice, his faith in the system is pushed to its breaking point. He must decide how far he's willing to go for revenge against the man who tore his family apart and whether he can risk losing himself in the process. With a high-profile police misconduct trial looming, the clock ticks down on Malcolm's last chance to expose the truth and confront his son's attacker. Ashes of Justice is a gripping tale of loss, vengeance, and the painful search for justice in a world where truth and integrity are buried under layers of corruption. For Malcolm, justice may come at a price he never imagined, and the cost could be his very soul. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. Malcolm King always started his mornings the same way. The hum of the coffee machine, the quiet patter of slippers as he moved through his modest kitchen, and a quick peek out the window to check the early morning sky. For a man who had spent years in the service, Malcolm cherished the routine, the calm predictability. But it was the sounds of life waking up in his home that gave him the most peace, a peace he had fought hard to build. The unmistakable rustling of his son, Jordan, echoed from the hallway, a barely 16-year-old stretching the limits of morning discipline. Malcolm allowed himself a soft chuckle as he poured 2 mugs of coffee, only one of them decaf. "Come on, Jordan. Clock's ticking," he called, his voice a low baritone that still carried that military crispness. Jordan appeared, tousle-haired and yawning, in the doorway. "Dad, it's Saturday. Can't we skip just one morning jog?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Malcolm handed him the mug, raising an eyebrow. "You want to skip a jog? Just because it's Saturday? You know what they say about Saturdays, son." Jordan shook his head, suppressing a groan. "No, but I feel like you're about to tell me." "Saturdays are for the people who want to be better on Sundays," Malcolm replied with a grin, taking a sip of his coffee. Jordan rolled his eyes, but he was already lacing up his sneakers. It was their unspoken ritual, these weekend jogs, these quiet moments that were part exercise and part life lesson. Malcolm knew his son rolled his eyes at the advice now, but he also knew that deep down Jordan respected him, listened even. They stepped out into the dawn light, the quiet streets stretching out before them. The neighborhood was one of those old, close-knit communities where everyone knew each other, at least by sight. The early morning air was brisk, the kind that snapped you awake and cleared your mind. Malcolm led the way down the path they took every Saturday, steady and familiar. "So Jordan," Malcolm began as they rounded a corner, "what's the latest? School treating you all right?" Jordan shrugged. "It's okay. Ms. Reynolds assigned us this history project. We're supposed to research family heritage and all that." "Heritage, huh?" Malcolm glanced at his son. "Well, that sounds like a chance to show off a little, doesn't it? We've got quite a bit of heritage to share." "Yeah, but I don't know," Jordan hesitated, looking away. "Sometimes it feels like people just look at me different, you know? Like they don't expect much. I don't get why they keep reminding us of where we come from instead of seeing where we're going." Malcolm paused, feeling a pang. He knew all too well what Jordan meant. It was the same unspoken tension he'd felt his whole life, the weight of assumptions, the silent barriers. "They can only see what they're ready to see," he replied, his voice gentle. "But it's our job to prove them wrong." They continued down the road in silence, the peaceful morning air laced with shared understanding. As they circled back towards the house, Malcolm noticed Jordan growing pensive, his gaze drifting toward the busier streets ahead, where sounds of traffic and city life were beginning to stir. "You got plans for today, son?" Jordan nodded, his face brightening. "Yeah, thought I'd head out to the rec center with some friends, play a few rounds, maybe hit the court for a while." "Sounds good," Malcolm replied, pride evident in his tone. "Just remember, stay out of trouble, don't talk to strangers, and be back before dark," Jordan finished, a smirk playing at his lips. "Got it, Dad. Been hearing that speech since I was 6. Malcolm chuckled, ruffling his son's hair before they stepped back into the house. "One day you'll thank me." Later that day, after Jordan had left, Malcolm felt a small twinge of unease as he settled into the quiet of the house. He chalked it up to the usual worries of fatherhood. Jordan was growing up fast, and the world felt different than it had in Malcolm's youth. There was always a part of him that held back a slight worry each time his son left, a silent prayer that he would be okay. He checked his watch, mentally noting that Jordan would be home before dusk, just like they had agreed. Malcolm settled into his armchair with the newspaper, trying to lose himself in the pages, but the uneasy feeling lingered like a shadow in the back of his mind. The hours slipped by and evening came. The dimming light cast long shadows across the room, and Malcolm realized with a start that Jordan should have been home by now. He checked his phone, no missed messages. Frowning, he texted Jordan a quick, casual all good. Minutes passed, then 20, then 30 with no reply. His gut clenched. He dialed his son's number, listening as it rang and rang with no answer. Finally, his phone vibrated with a new message. Relief flooded him until he saw the sender. It was a friend of Jordan's. His tone panicked. "Mr. King, you need to come down to the hospital right away. Something happened." Malcolm's world shifted on its axis. He didn't remember much of the drive to the hospital, just a blur of flashing lights and the shrill scream of his heartbeat echoing in his mind. He pushed through the ER doors, his gaze scanning for any sign of his son. An officer stood there, expression unreadable. "Mr. King." Malcolm's voice was little more than a hoarse whisper. "Where's my son?" The officer's expression faltered for a brief moment, and then he gestured toward a nearby doctor. "Your son was involved in an incident. There was an altercation." Malcolm's hands clenched into fists. An altercation. The word felt sterile, clinical, as if it could even begin to contain the damage implied. He followed the doctor down the sterile hallway, each step echoing louder in his mind as he braced himself for whatever lay beyond. And when he finally saw Jordan bandaged, bruised, a machine beeping steadily beside him, Malcolm felt something break deep within him. His son lay there, eyes closed, his once bright face marred with injuries he didn't deserve. Anger, guilt, and heartbreak tangled inside Malcolm's chest as he stood, helpless, at his son's bedside. He took a shaky breath, his mind whirling with questions, fears, and a searing, unfamiliar fury. The peaceful life he had fought so hard to build had been shattered in a single, brutal moment. And as Malcolm sat by his son's side, he knew this was only the beginning. Malcolm sat frozen at Jordan's bedside, his mind struggling to process the sight in front of him. His son lay there, unmoving, bruises painting his face, his left arm wrapped in gauze, hooked to machines monitoring every heartbeat, every breath. The soft, sterile beeping filled the room with a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo his own heart, pounding with helpless fury. A doctor stepped quietly into the room. "Mr. King." Malcolm didn't turn immediately, unwilling to tear his eyes away from Jordan. Finally, he nodded, acknowledging the doctor's presence. "Your son suffered multiple contusions, a mild concussion, and a fractured wrist," the doctor explained, his voice calm but tinged with something Malcolm couldn't quite place. Was it sympathy? Pity? He's stable now, but he'll need rest and time to heal. How did this happen? Malcolm's voice was low, barely contained. What did they do to him? The doctor hesitated, glancing toward the hallway, and Malcolm followed his gaze. A police officer, Officer Miller, stood just outside the room, his posture rigid, his gaze flickering away whenever Malcolm looked his way. "He's under sedation," the doctor continued, carefully. "He's not conscious to give a statement." But the officer outside said Jordan was involved in an altercation. He paused, clearing his throat. "I believe Officer Blake was involved." Malcolm's fists clenched, his knuckles white. "Officer Blake." "Yes," the doctor's expression softened. "I'm so sorry, Mr. King. We see these situations too often, and too many of them end here." Malcolm's vision blurred, the doctor's words merging into a haze of background noise. His mind spun back to every warning he'd ever given Jordan, every reminder to stay out of trouble, to come home before dark. He'd done everything to prepare his son, to protect him, and still, it hadn't been enough. The doctor left, and Officer Miller cautiously stepped into the room, clearing his throat. "Mr. King, the first understand this is a difficult time," he began, his tone clipped, impersonal. "But we're handling this. Officer Blake reported that your son resisted arrest." Malcolm felt a sudden, fiery heat in his chest. "Resisted arrest? My son?" Jordan wouldn't hurt a fly. He rose to his feet, his gaze steady, daring the officer to contradict him. "What was he arrested for?" According to Officer Blake, he matched the description of a suspect we were looking for, Miller replied, his words sounding rehearsed, mechanical. When approached, he became aggressive. Malcolm's fists tightened. You expect me to believe that my son, a 16-year-old kid who was just out with friends, was so dangerous that Blake had to put him in the hospital? The officer's expression hardened. Mr. King, the first can understand your frustration, but Officer Blake followed protocol. Protocol. Malcolm's voice cracked with barely suppressed fury. If this is protocol, then it's a broken system. Officer Miller held his ground, though Malcolm noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for a clipboard. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, that's your right, but please understand that the department has protocols for these situations. Right? Malcolm's voice was like ice. So you'll investigate yourselves, and meanwhile my son lies here fighting to wake up. Miller's eyes flickered, and he muttered something about due process before leaving the room. Malcolm sank back into the chair by Jordan's bed, exhaustion suddenly weighing on him. He reached out, carefully taking his son's hand, feeling the warmth beneath his fingers, fragile and yet reassuring. Minutes stretched into hours, Malcolm unable to look away, to even close his eyes for fear of missing a sign of life. Eventually, he heard the quiet murmur of voices outside the room, familiar ones. Glancing up, he saw a group of neighbors standing in the hallway, gathering with grim expressions and sorrowful eyes. Mrs. Johnson, who had known Malcolm since he was a child, walked in with slow steps, her eyes wet with unshed tears. Malcolm, she whispered, reaching out to place a hand on his shoulder. We heard about Jordan. I'm so sorry. He's a good boy. We're all praying for him. The words were like a balm to his raw, wounded soul, and he managed a grateful nod. Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. Another neighbor, Mr. Daniels, stepped forward. You know, we've had problems with that officer before, he said, voice low but firm. Blake's been targeting young men in the neighborhood for months now. My nephew had a run-in with him just last year. Malcolm's brow furrowed, the pieces beginning to click together. So, it's not just Jordan. Mr. Daniels shook his head. He's got it out for the young ones in our community, Malcolm. We've tried to report it, but they close ranks. Nothing ever comes of it. The room seemed to close in around Malcolm as the realization dawned. He wasn't just fighting for his son, this was a fight for every family that had been torn apart by that same arrogance, that same abuse of power. Jordan's face flashed before him, peaceful in his sedation, but a surge of anger and determination filled his chest. This can't go on, Malcolm said, his voice barely above a whisper, but those around him felt the strength in his words. I'm going to make sure they don't sweep this under the rug. Not this time. Mrs. Johnson's hand tightened on his shoulder, a silent pledge of support, and she nodded. Whatever you need, Malcolm, we'll stand by you. Malcolm looked at the faces surrounding him, neighbors, friends, people he'd grown up with, who had watched his son grow. They shared his pain, his anger, his need for justice. In that moment, he knew he couldn't do this alone. But he wouldn't have to. He would fight, not just for Jordan, but for everyone in this community who had been wronged, silenced, ignored, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. As night fell, Malcolm sat back beside his son, feeling the first threads of a plan weaving through his mind. He could feel the weight of what lay ahead, the battles he would face. But in his heart, he felt a new strength, a father's love transformed into resolve. He leaned close to his son, brushing a hand over Jordan's bruised forehead. You hang on, son, he murmured softly. I'm not letting them get away with this. Not ever. The sun was barely up when Malcolm returned to the hospital. He hadn't slept, but his mind was sharp, focused. Sitting by Jordan's bed, he could see the shallow rise and fall of his son's chest, each breath a reminder of the battle ahead. Jordan was stable but still unresponsive. Every bruise, every cut was a reminder of Officer Blake's brutality, of a system that allowed such things to happen unchecked. Today was the day Malcolm would begin to hold them accountable. He would start by filing a complaint, a formal record of what happened, and rallying anyone who could testify about Officer Blake's pattern of behavior. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he didn't care. He owed it to Jordan and to every other young person in their community who had been wrongfully targeted. Malcolm, I know what you're thinking, came a voice from the doorway. Malcolm turned to see Mr. Daniels, his neighbor, standing there with a determined look. A few of us have been talking. You're not alone in this. Whatever you need, we're here. Malcolm nodded, grateful. Thank you. I didn't realize how deep this went. Mr. Daniels stepped forward, his face hardening. That's how they operate. They count on us keeping quiet, moving on. But not this time. We're done staying silent. Their words were interrupted by the soft hum of Malcolm's phone. A notification lit up the screen, a text from a local activist group. Word had already started to spread. His inbox was flooded with messages of support, people wanting to know how they could help, where they could gather to demand answers. Malcolm felt a swell of gratitude and strength. He was no longer just one father fighting alone. This had become a movement, and that gave him hope. An hour later, Malcolm arrived at the police precinct, a quiet determination about him. The building loomed, stark and gray, and Malcolm felt a ripple of unease as he entered. But he forced himself to walk straight to the front desk, squaring his shoulders. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to file a formal complaint against Officer Wyatt Blake." The receptionist, a young woman with dark hair and tired eyes, looked up at him, barely concealing her sigh. "Name of the complainant?" "Malcolm King," he replied. "The incident involves my son Jordan King, who was assaulted by Officer Blake 2 nights ago." The receptionist's eyes flickered with something, perhaps recognition or sympathy, before her professional mask slid back into place. "One moment, Mr. King," she typed into her computer, then nodded. "You'll need to speak with Lieutenant Harper. I'll let him know you're here." Malcolm waited, his hands clenched into fists. The room was quiet, almost oppressively so, as he watched officers come and go, their expressions neutral, unreadable. Finally, Lieutenant Harper appeared, his expression guarded, his gaze assessing. "Mr. King," he greeted Malcolm, gesturing for him to follow. "I understand you wish to file a complaint against Officer Blake." "Yes," Malcolm replied, feeling his anger rise. "What he did to my son is unacceptable. I want it on record." Harper led him into a small office, gesturing for Malcolm to take a seat. "I understand this must be difficult for you," he began, his tone measured. "But I must caution you. Filing a complaint is a formal process and there will be an investigation. Officer Blake's record is clean, and any accusations will need substantial evidence." Malcolm clenched his jaw. "You're telling me that the bruises on my son's face aren't evidence enough?" Harper's gaze didn't waver. "Officer Blake reported that your son resisted arrest and became aggressive. It's standard protocol in such situations." "Standard protocol," Malcolm interrupted, voice tight with anger. "My son is lying in a hospital bed, and you're calling this protocol?" Harper leaned back, folding his hands. "Mr. King, the first not here to debate the specifics of police procedure with you. But we take accusations seriously. If you want to file, you can submit a written statement, and we will investigate." Malcolm felt the frustration bubbling inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Fine," he said. "I'll file my statement." He spent the next hour writing down every detail he could remember, pouring his emotions into the words, knowing that every sentence would become part of the official record. As he finished, he handed the document to Harper, who took it with a nod. "We'll be in touch, Mr. King," Harper said, standing up to escort him out. "I suggest you prepare for a process that may take some time." Malcolm looked Harper squarely in the eyes. "I'm prepared to wait as long as it takes." Outside, Malcolm took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. As he stepped down the precinct steps, he was greeted by a small group of community members who had gathered in support. Mrs. Johnson stood at the front, holding a sign that read "Justice for Jordan." Beside her were Jordan's friends, their faces solemn, fists clenched. "How'd it go?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and concern. Malcolm shook his head. "They're going to investigate, but they're already protecting him." Mr. Daniels, who had joined the gathering, shook his head in disgust. "That's how it goes, Malcolm. But we're not letting this slide. We'll be out here every day if we have to." Malcolm's heart swelled with a fierce pride as he looked around. These people were here for him, for Jordan, for justice. It wasn't just his fight anymore, it was theirs. One of Jordan's friends, a young man named Tyler, stepped forward. "Mr. King, the first, don't know if it helps, but I saw the whole thing that night. I was with Jordan when it happened." Malcolm's eyes widened. "Tyler, you're saying you're a witness?" Tyler nodded, his face determined. "Yes, sir. Officer Blake came out of nowhere, threw Jordan against the car. We didn't do anything wrong." A spark ignited within Malcolm. "Then I'll need you to testify. This is going on the record. Every word of it." Tyler's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I'll do it. Jordan deserves that much." Malcolm looked around, his gaze landing on each person gathered there. "This is just the beginning. They want us to wait, to trust in their process, but we know better. If we have to take this to the courts, to the media, we'll do it. We're going to make sure they can't hide this." A murmur of agreement passed through the group, their resolve evident. Malcolm felt his strength returning. The anger he felt wasn't just as it belonged to everyone here, everyone who had ever been hurt, ignored, or silenced. They were united, and that gave him hope. As they dispersed, Malcolm's phone vibrated with another message, this time from a local reporter who had caught wind of the story. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it. The words were simple but powerful, "Mr. King, if you're willing to speak, we're willing to listen." Malcolm stared at the message, his heart pounding. He'd never been one to seek the spotlight, but this was different. If it took public attention to bring justice for Jordan, he would do it. He replied, setting the wheels in motion. This was no longer just about his son's injuries. This was a fight for truth, for justice, and for every family in his community. As he made his way back to the hospital, Malcolm felt a strange calm wash over him. His resolve was firm. He would not rest until those responsible were held accountable, and no matter how hard they tried to silence him, he would be heard. Malcolm sat by Jordan's bed, watching the slow rhythm of his son's breathing. The sterile hospital room felt suffocating, each minute dragging on as he waited for Jordan to show signs of waking up. He had spent the last few days filing complaints, speaking to witnesses, and rallying community members, but he felt like he was swimming against a tide that wouldn't relent. As he stared at Jordan's bruised face, a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see a woman in a neat, dark suit standing in the doorway, holding a leather briefcase. She had a serious but warm expression, her eyes meeting his with a sense of purpose. "Mr. King," she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Yes, that's me," Malcolm replied, standing up. The woman extended her hand. "My name is Maya Grant. I'm a civil rights attorney. I've heard about what happened to your son, and I wanted to offer my help." Malcolm shook her hand, feeling a flicker of relief. He'd heard of Maya Grant, a well-respected attorney known for taking on tough cases, especially those involving police misconduct. Her presence felt like a lifeline, a chance to make a real impact. "Thank you, Ms. Grant," he said, motioning for her to sit. "I appreciate you coming. I've been trying to get answers, but they're stonewalling me at every turn." Maya nodded, her expression serious. "Unfortunately, that's common in cases like these. The system is built to protect its own, especially when officers are involved, but that doesn't mean we're powerless." She opened her briefcase, pulling out a notepad and pen. "I want to gather as much information as possible about what happened. I understand there was a witness who saw the incident." "Yes," Malcolm replied. "One of Jordan's friends, Tyler, was there. He's willing to testify about what he saw." "That's good," Maya said, jotting down notes. "Witnesses are crucial in cases like these, especially when we're up against the word of a police officer." Malcolm's frustration simmered. "It shouldn't be like this. My son was hurt, and they're already trying to paint him as the aggressor. They even told me he resisted arrest, but Jordan isn't that kind of kid. He's never been in trouble before." Maya looked up, her gaze steady. "I believe you, Mr. King, and I've seen this pattern too many times. The first step they take is to discredit the victim, especially when they're young black men, but we won't let them control the narrative." Just as Malcolm was about to respond, there was another knock on the door. This time, a man in his 30s with a camera around his neck stepped inside. His face lit up with a nervous but earnest smile as he introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Leon Porter, a journalist with the City Ledger," he said, shaking Malcolm's hand. "I've been following stories of police misconduct in this area, and, well, I heard about what happened to Jordan. I wanted to see if I could help by telling his story." Malcolm felt a surge of cautious hope. He glanced at Maya, who nodded subtly, as if to reassure him. Speaking to the media was risky, but Leon's presence seemed genuine, and the right story could shift public opinion in their favor. "Thank you, Mr. Porter," Malcolm said, motioning for Leon to take a seat. "I'm open to anything that could help, but I need you to promise you'll tell the truth, the whole truth. I don't want them twisting his story any more than they already have." Leon nodded vigorously. "Absolutely, Mr. King. That's why I'm here to tell the story that they don't want the public to see." Leon set up his recording device, and Maya sat beside Malcolm, providing quiet support. The questions started slow, gentle, as Leon asked Malcolm about Jordan, about the kind of young man he was, and about the events that had led to that terrible night. Malcolm's voice faltered as he recounted the call he'd received, the sight of Jordan lying in the hospital bed, and the hopelessness he'd felt as he faced the indifference of the police. "They said he was resisting," Malcolm said, his voice choked with emotion. "But my son was just walking home. He's a good kid, doesn't get into trouble. I taught him to respect others, to avoid confrontations, and yet, here we are." Leon nodded, his expression one of deep empathy. "I've covered stories like this before," he admitted, his voice quiet, "and too often the truth gets buried. But we won't let that happen here, Mr. King. We're going to bring this to light." Maya leaned forward. "With enough community support, we can pressure the department into taking this seriously. Public opinion matters, especially when the city's eyes are watching." As Leon continued gathering details, a sense of unity filled the room. Malcolm felt for the first time that he wasn't entirely alone in this fight. He had people who were willing to stand by him, to amplify his voice, to make sure Jordan's story couldn't be silenced. Once the interview wrapped up, Leon packed his equipment, thanking Malcolm again. "I'll be in touch," he promised, his tone earnest. "We're publishing this story tomorrow. I'll make sure you see it first." After Leon left, Maya placed a reassuring hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "This is a good step, Malcolm. But we need to prepare ourselves. This story may draw attention from people who won't be happy about it." Malcolm nodded, determination hardening in his chest. "I'm not backing down, Ms. Grant. Not now. I don't care what they throw at me." A flicker of respect crossed Maya's face. "That's the spirit we need, Mr. King. And remember, you're not alone in this. I've seen what you're up against, and I'm here for the long haul." They discussed the next steps, focusing on gathering more evidence and planning a public rally to draw attention to Jordan's case. As Maya outlined the legal process, Malcolm found himself mentally preparing for the long battle ahead. Each detail, every step, felt like a brick in the foundation of the justice he sought for Jordan. Malcolm sat at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the newspaper in front of him. The front-page article detailed Jordan's case, the accusations against Officer Blake, and the push for justice led by Malcolm and his community. The words painted a portrait of bravery, of a family demanding accountability. For a moment, Malcolm felt proud that Jordan's story had reached people beyond the walls of their neighborhood, proud that they were being heard. But as he read further, his chest tightened. The article included a statement from the police department, carefully worded and cautious. They claimed that the incident involving Jordan was under review, and that Officer Blake had been placed on temporary administrative leave, pending the results of an internal investigation. The spokesperson went on to express regret over any misunderstandings or mischaracterizations that had arisen in the wake of the incident, insisting that the department would uphold justice impartially. To Malcolm, the words felt hollow, as if crafted to dismiss the severity of what had happened. Worse still was the insinuation in the article that Jordan had somehow matched the description of a suspect in a recent crime spree. The implication stung, twisting the narrative to make Jordan appear guilty by association. As Malcolm finished reading, the phone rang, breaking the heavy silence in the room. He picked it up, expecting to hear Maya or maybe Leon with an update. But the voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "Mr. King," the voice asked, a slight edge to it. "Yes, this is Malcolm King," he replied warily. "This is Lieutenant Harper. I wanted to discuss the article that ran this morning. It's come to my attention that you've made some rather serious accusations against Officer Blake." Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. "Accusations? My son is lying in a hospital bed because of what Officer Blake did." "Mr. King, the first understand your concerns," Harper continued, his voice smooth but cold. "But you need to realize that public accusations like these have consequences. You're putting your son's name out there, associating him with violent rhetoric and inflaming tensions." Malcolm's jaw clenched. "My son isn't the one inciting violence. He's the one who was hurt." "Be that as it may," Harper replied, his tone sharpening, "this department won't tolerate slander. Officer Blake has an impeccable record, and this story you're pushing could damage the trust between the community and the police. I would hate to see this situation get out of control." "Is that a threat?" Lieutenant Malcolm asked, his voice steely. Harper paused. "Of course not. I'm merely advising caution. For your sake, Mr. King, and for your family's sake." The line went dead, leaving Malcolm seething. He felt the full weight of what Harper had implied, that the police were watching him, monitoring his every move. They wanted him to back down, to stay silent. But they had underestimated him. Malcolm slammed the phone down, his heart pounding. As he stood there, trying to control his anger, the door opened and his wife, Sharon, walked in, her face drawn and tense. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice quiet. Malcolm took a breath, steadying himself. "Lieutenant Harper. He's warning me. Trying to get me to drop the complaint." Sharon's face paled and she sank into a chair, shaking her head. "Malcolm, this is getting dangerous. What if they come after us? After Jordan?" "They already came after Jordan," Malcolm replied, his voice a mix of anger and sorrow. "That's why I have to do this." Sharon looked down, her fingers twisting nervously. "I'm scared, Malcolm. I'm scared of what might happen if you keep pushing. What if they retaliate? What if something happens to you too?" He reached out, placing his hand over hers. "I'm scared too. But if we don't stand up now, if we don't show them that we won't be intimidated, then they'll keep doing this. Not just to Jordan, but to others. We can't let them control us with fear." Sharon's eyes were wet with unshed tears, but she nodded, a small, trembling nod of reluctant agreement. "I understand. Just be careful, please." Malcolm squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of her worry but knowing there was no turning back. He kissed her forehead, holding her close for a moment before she slipped away to check on Jordan, still asleep in his room. That afternoon, Malcolm met Maya at her office to discuss the next steps. The article had already sparked reactions across the city, but with Harper's call fresh in his mind, Malcolm felt a renewed urgency to fortify their approach. "They're trying to scare me off," he told her, relaying Harper's thinly veiled threats. Maya's eyes narrowed, her mouth set in a grim line. "That's classic intimidation. They're hoping you'll drop the case to avoid trouble." "Well, they're in for a surprise," Malcolm said, determination solidifying within him. "I'm not backing down." "Good," Maya replied. "But we need to be smart about this. They'll try to discredit Jordan any way they can. I've seen them pull up school records, talk to neighbors, anything to paint him as a troublemaker. We need to get ahead of them." Malcolm's stomach twisted. "Jordan has never been in trouble. He's a good kid, respectful. They're just going to make things up, aren't they?" Maya nodded, her expression sympathetic. "It's ugly, but yes, they're going to do everything they can to protect Blake in the department. But that's where we fight back. Leon has already spoken to several witnesses from the community, and they're willing to speak on Jordan's behalf." Malcolm felt a flicker of hope. "Witnesses?" "Yes," Maya said. "People who know Jordan, who saw the kind of boy he is and are outraged by what happened. The more people we have to vouch for him, the harder it will be for them to smear his name." They spent the next few hours strategizing, compiling names and organizing witness statements. Maya was tireless, guiding Malcolm through each step, her experience shining through. But every document they prepared, every witness they secured felt like another layer of protection around Jordan's story, a story they wouldn't let the police twist to suit their agenda. As Malcolm left Maya's office, he noticed a group of protesters gathering across the street, holding signs in support of Jordan. The crowd was small, but their presence was loud and visible, their voices calling for accountability, for transparency, for justice. Malcolm watched, feeling a swell of gratitude and pride. His community was rallying, standing beside him and refusing to let his family's suffering be buried under bureaucratic indifference. And as he watched the crowd grow, he realized just how powerful they could be together. One of the protesters noticed him and called out, "Mr. King, we're with you." Others joined in, their voices ringing out in support. Malcolm raised his hand in acknowledgement, a silent promise that he would keep fighting not just for Jordan, but for everyone they represented. That night, as Malcolm returned home, the resolve in his heart felt stronger than ever. Harper's warning echoed in his mind, a reminder of the obstacles that lay ahead. But it was the voices of the protesters, of his neighbors, of the witnesses ready to testify that bolstered his spirit. He entered Jordan's room, watching his son's peaceful, sleeping face. In that moment, he made a promise to himself, a vow that he would protect his son's name, that he would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. He sat beside Jordan, whispering softly, "They think they can silence us, son. But they're wrong. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what really happened, and I won't stop until justice is served." The night was quiet around him, but Malcolm could feel the storm building, a reckoning on the horizon that he was more than willing to face. The days blurred together in a haze of meetings, interviews, and escalating tension. Malcolm's life had become a cycle of hospital visits, community gatherings, and conversations with Maya and Leon. Every morning he'd leave Jordan's bedside to rally support, and every night he returned to sit by his son, whispering words of encouragement that his boy might never hear. Today, as he made his way back to the hospital, Malcolm's mind felt heavy with exhaustion. Maya had warned him that they'd face resistance, but the lengths the department was willing to go to shield Officer Blake felt like a nightmare without end. Every time he felt they were making progress, another obstacle appeared, another subtle threat surfaced, another doubt crept into the minds of those around him. As he walked through the hospital's sterile halls, Malcolm spotted Sharon waiting outside Jordan's room, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as he approached, and he could see the worry etched deeply into her features. "Malcolm," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." He nodded, bracing himself for whatever news she had to share. They stepped aside, finding a quiet corner near the window where sunlight filtered through, casting long shadows across the floor. "They came by earlier," Sharon began, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "Two officers. They asked questions about Jordan, about his friends, about us." Malcolm's jaw clenched, anger simmering beneath his fatigue. "What kind of questions?" "They wanted to know if Jordan had ever been in trouble," Sharon said, her voice breaking. "They were fishing, Malcolm, trying to find anything they could use against him." He felt a surge of anger so powerful it was almost blinding. "This is what they do," he muttered, his voice low and bitter. "They can't defend what Blake did, so they're trying to turn the blame on Jordan. They want to make it look like he brought this on himself." Sharon's eyes filled with tears. "Malcolm, I don't know how much more of this I can take. Every time I think we're making progress, it feels like we're getting pulled deeper into a fight we can't win." Malcolm reached out, taking her hand in his, feeling the weight of her fear, her exhaustion, her exhaustion. He understood it all too well. For days now, he'd been caught in a spiral of frustration, anger, and grief. He had started this fight believing that justice would prevail, but now he wasn't so sure. The police were a powerful force, and they seemed determined to bury the truth, no matter the cost. But as he looked into Sharon's eyes, he knew he couldn't give up. "We can't let them do this, Sharon," he said, his voice firm. "They want us to back down, to give in. But I'm not letting them destroy our son's name. I won't let them win." Sharon nodded, wiping her eyes. "Just promise me you'll be careful, Malcolm. I don't want to lose you too." He pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly. "I promise." That evening, Malcolm attended a community meeting organized by local activists. The room was packed with friends, neighbors, people from across the city who had come to show their support. Leon was there, taking notes and snapping photos, and Maya stood at the front, briefing everyone on the latest updates in Jordan's case. When it was Malcolm's turn to speak, he felt the weight of every eye in the room on him. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the anger simmering just below the surface. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "I wish I could say we've made progress, that the police are listening, that they're doing the right thing. But the truth is, they're doing everything they can to silence us, to twist the story and make it look like Jordan is at fault." A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd, and Malcolm saw nods of agreement, faces reflecting the same frustration he felt. He took a deep breath, pushing forward. "They came to my house today, questioning my family, trying to find dirt on my son. They're doing everything they can to protect Officer Blake, while my boy lies in a hospital bed, unable to defend himself." The crowd grew restless, their anger palpable. Malcolm felt his own fury grow, stoked by the shared sense of injustice in the room. "We're not backing down," he continued, his voice rising with conviction. "We're going to keep fighting, keep pushing until they have no choice but to face the truth. I'm asking each of you to stand with us, to raise your voices to make sure they can't ignore us." A roar of support erupted from the crowd, a wave of solidarity that filled Malcolm with a renewed sense of purpose. For a moment he felt hope, a flicker of belief that they could indeed make a difference. But as the meeting wrapped up and people began to disperse, he felt a familiar hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Leon, his face etched with concern. "Malcolm," Leon said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "I've been hearing things. People talking about retaliation." Malcolm's face darkened. "Retaliation?" Leon nodded. "The department doesn't like what you're doing. They don't like that you're making noise, that you're putting pressure on them. Be careful. They could come after you next." The warning settled in Malcolm's chest like a heavy weight. He had always known this fight was dangerous, that pushing against the police could have consequences. But hearing it from Leon made it real, made it urgent. "Thank you, Leon," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I appreciate the heads up." As Malcolm walked back to his car, his mind raced. He could feel the tension in every step, the weight of the warnings and the threats hanging over him. Part of him wanted to scream, to unleash the fury that had been building inside him for days. He wanted to confront Officer Blake, to make him pay for what he'd done, to fight back against a system that seemed determined to protect its own, no matter the cost. But he knew he couldn't give in to that anger. Not yet. Sitting in his car, Malcolm gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he fought to keep control. He thought of Jordan, of the dreams his son had once had, of the bright future that had been stolen from him. He thought of Sharon, of her plea for him to be careful, her fear of losing him too. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, letting the anger course through him before finally releasing it. No, he wouldn't take matters into his own hands. Not yet. He would stick to the plan, he would gather evidence, he would fight this legally. But he couldn't deny the dark temptation that lingered in the back of his mind, the thought of making Officer Blake feel the same pain he had inflicted on Jordan. As he sat there, a quiet resolve settled over him. He would continue down this path, but if the system failed him, if the law refused to bring justice, he would do whatever it took to make things right. For now, though, he would stay the course. For Jordan, for Sharon, for the community that was counting on him. But deep down, Malcolm knew that if they pushed him too far, there would be no turning back. Malcolm sat across from Maya in her small, cluttered office, feeling a faint but growing sense of hope. The walls were covered in framed certificates and photos from past cases she'd worked on, each one a reminder of her dedication to justice. Today they were reviewing documents from Leon's recent investigation files that, with a bit of luck, might finally prove that Officer Blake was no stranger to incidents of misconduct. Maya handed Malcolm a stack of papers, her expression serious but determined. "These are complaints filed against Blake over the last few years. There are more than a few, and most of them involve excessive force." Malcolm's hands shook slightly as he flipped through the pages, each report describing a different incident. Young men who had been pulled over without cause, witnesses who had been intimidated, families who had been left afraid to speak out. It was a pattern that painted Officer Blake as exactly the type of person Malcolm had suspected him to be. "Why haven't any of these cases gone anywhere?" Malcolm asked, his voice tight with frustration. "Why is this man still on the force?" Maya sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It's the way the system works, unfortunately. The police union protects officers like Blake, and internal investigations rarely lead to real consequences. Most complaints get buried under bureaucratic paperwork, and witnesses are often too afraid to testify." Malcolm looked down, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. These people, they trusted the system to protect them, and it failed them, just like it's failing Jordan. "That's why we need to be smart about this," Maya said, her gaze steady. "This isn't just about Jordan anymore. If we can show that Blake has a history of this behavior, it'll be harder for the department to ignore what he did. We need to build a case so strong that they can't sweep it under the rug." Malcolm nodded, feeling a renewed determination. "So what's our next step?" "We'll need to contact the individuals named in these complaints," Maya explained. "See if they're willing to come forward to testify about their experiences with Blake. It won't be easy, some of them may still be scared, or they may have moved on. But if we can get even one or two of them to speak out, it'll make a difference." Malcolm nodded, the weight of the task settling over him. "I'll help in any way I can. They deserve to be heard." That evening, Malcolm made his way to one of the addresses listed in the complaint files. The neighborhood was quiet, with small houses lining the street, each one illuminated by the soft glow of porch lights. He stopped in front of a modest home, checking the name on the report, Mr. Samuel Reed, a man in his 40s who had filed a complaint against Officer Blake just over a year ago. Taking a deep breath, Malcolm knocked on the door. A few moments later, the door opened, revealing a tall, thin man with a wary expression. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Malcolm. "Can I help you?" Mr. Reed asked, his voice cautious. "Mr. Reed, my name is Malcolm King," he began, keeping his tone respectful. I'm the father of Jordan King. My son was injured by Officer Blake, and I'm trying to gather information to bring a case against him." Mr. Reed's face softened slightly, though his guard remained up. "I remember hearing about your boy. I'm real sorry for what happened to him." "Thank you," Malcolm replied, feeling a pang in his chest. "I'm here because I saw your name in a complaint file. I know it's a lot to ask, but if you'd be willing to share your experience with Officer Blake, it would help us make a stronger case." Mr. Reed sighed, glancing back into his house as if weighing the risks. "I've got kids, Mr. King," he said quietly. "After what happened, my wife begged me to keep my head down to avoid trouble. We've worked hard to stay out of the department's sight." "I understand," Malcolm replied gently, "but if we don't stand up to this, he'll keep doing it. He's not just hurting us, he's hurting our whole community. And he'll keep getting away with it unless we stop him." Mr. Reed looked down, his face filled with a mix of fear and anger. After a long pause, he nodded. "I'll think about it. I'll talk to my wife. If she agrees, I'll testify." Malcolm felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you. You don't know how much this means." As Malcolm turned to leave, Mr. Reed called after him, "Mr. King?" Malcolm looked back. "Good luck. And be careful. Blake's got friends in high places. People who will do whatever it takes to protect him." Malcolm nodded, the warning settling into his mind like a dark cloud. "Thank you. I'll be careful." The next morning, Malcolm awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He picked it up, squinting at the screen, a message from Maya. "They're putting more pressure on us. Blake's lawyer just issued a statement accusing Jordan of assault. We need to get in front of this." Malcolm's heart sank. They were twisting the narrative yet again, trying to paint Jordan as the aggressor. He felt the familiar anger boiling up, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was exactly what Maya had warned him about, and he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. He quickly texted back, "Let's meet today. We need to show them we're not backing down." After sending the message, Malcolm got dressed and headed to Maya's office. When he arrived, he found her already poring over a stack of documents, her brow furrowed with concentration. "They're doubling down," she said without looking up. "Blake's team is going to try to turn this into a case of self-defense. They're claiming that Jordan threatened him, that he feared for his life." Malcolm's hands clenched into fists. "My son wouldn't threaten anyone. This is a lie, and they know it." "I know," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. "But the court will require evidence. We need more witnesses, more statements from people who've seen Blake's behavior firsthand." "Mr. Reed said he'd testify," Malcolm replied. "He was hesitant, but I think he's willing to come forward." Maya's face lit up with a glimmer of hope. "That's good. Every voice counts." Just then, Leon entered the room, his expression tense. "Malcolm, Maya just got off the phone with another witness, a young woman named Tasha. She says Blake harassed her brother last year, but they didn't file a report because they were afraid of retaliation." Maya's gaze sharpened. "Did she say she'd be willing to talk?" Leon nodded. "She said she'd do whatever it takes to help Jordan. She's fed up with the way the department treats people in our community." Malcolm felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. The pieces were finally coming together. For every person who tried to silence them, there were others who were ready to stand up, to fight back, to make sure Jordan's story and their own would be heard. "We need to move quickly," Maya said, a new energy in her voice. "If we can get these testimonies on record, we'll have a strong case to present. They won't be able to ignore this." As they strategized, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of hope. It was fragile like a flicker in the darkness, but it was there. But for the first time in days, he felt as though they were making real progress, that justice for Jordan wasn't just a distant dream but something they could achieve together. Yet, as they prepared to face Blake's legal team, Malcolm couldn't shake the lingering fear that had settled in his gut. The stakes were rising, and he knew that every step forward brought new risks, new dangers. But he also knew that giving up wasn't an option. He thought of Jordan, of Sharon, of every family who had been harmed by people like Blake. No matter what, he would see this through. For Jordan, for his family, for justice. Malcolm glanced at the clock on Maya's office wall, feeling the weight of each passing second. The rally they had organized was set to begin in less than 2 hours, and every part of him felt charged with a tense mixture of anticipation and dread. Today's rally was more than just a gathering, it was their last push to amplify Jordan's story and secure enough support to keep the pressure on the police department. Across from him, Maya was meticulously organizing their notes and witness statements. The folder in her hands held the testimonies from people like Mr. Reed and Tasha's stories of harassment, intimidation, and brutality, each one a testament to the reality that Officer Blake wasn't just a bad apple, he was part of a poisoned tree. "This rally is going to be pivotal," Maya said, not looking up. "It's our chance to show the community, the media, and the city officials that we're not backing down. But be prepared, they might try to disrupt it." Malcolm nodded, a sense of unease crawling up his spine. "I know. Leon told me they've already started planting rumors, trying to make it sound like we're organizing some sort of violent protest. They're setting the stage in case things go wrong." Maya's lips tightened. "That's what they do. But as long as we stay focused and keep it peaceful, they won't have any real ammunition." Just then, Leon entered the room, his expression tense. "Malcolm, Maya, I just got word that a few more people want to join us as witnesses. 2 men who had encounters with Blake years ago, but were too scared to come forward. They heard about Jordan's case and they're finally ready to speak." Maya's face lit up. "That's incredible, Leon. Every new testimony strengthens our case. If we can show that Blake's behavior has been consistent over the years, the department won't be able to ignore it." Malcolm felt a flicker of hope. "Do you think we have enough now? Enough to make them listen?" Maya nodded, a small smile breaking through her otherwise serious expression. "We're close. And with the rally today, the city will have to pay attention. They can't silence all of us." A few hours later, Malcolm stood on the edge of the crowd gathering at the city square, his heart pounding as he took in the sight before him. Hundreds of people had shown up, carrying signs that read "Justice for Jordan" and "Hold Blake accountable." Familiar faces from the neighborhood mingled with strangers who had heard about the rally and wanted to show their support. Sharon stood beside him, holding his hand tightly. She'd been hesitant to attend, but after the threats and harassment their family had faced, she understood that silence wasn't an option anymore. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, giving his hand a squeeze. "For Jordan, for everything you're doing." Malcolm managed a small smile, feeling a swell of gratitude for her support. "I couldn't do this without you." As Maya took the stage, the crowd quieted, and Malcolm felt his pulse quicken. She was a powerful speaker, her words sharp and unwavering, cutting through the tension that hung in the air. "We are here today," Maya began, her voice carrying across the square, "because we refuse to be silenced. We refuse to let our voices be drowned out by those who abuse their power. Jordan King's story is one of many, but today we are making a stand for him, for his family, and for everyone who has suffered at the hands of those who believe they are above the law." Applause erupted from the crowd, and Malcolm felt a sense of unity and strength radiating from the people around him. These weren't just neighbors or supporters, they were allies in a fight for justice. Maya continued, recounting Jordan's story, the lies the department had spread, and the testimonies they had gathered. Each word felt like a hammer, driving home the truth that had been hidden for too long. As the rally continued, Malcolm noticed a group of police officers standing near the edge of the square, watching the crowd with narrowed eyes. He recognized one of them, Lieutenant Harper, the man who had warned him over the phone. Harper's gaze locked onto Malcolm's, and for a brief moment, neither of them looked away. Malcolm felt a chill run down his spine. Harper's expression was unreadable, but Malcolm could feel the warning in his stare, the silent threat that seemed to linger between them. But Malcolm didn't back down. He held Harper's gaze, defying the unspoken command to retreat. This was his son's fight, his family's fight, and he wouldn't let intimidation silence him. Maya finished her speech, and then Leon stepped forward to address the crowd, sharing stories he'd gathered from other families, stories that echoed Jordan's and painted a damning picture of Officer Blake's history. "The stories you're hearing today are not isolated incidents," Leon said, his voice filled with emotion. "They're part of a pattern that has been allowed to exist because no one has held these people accountable. But today, we're changing that." The crowd cheered, their voices filling the square. Malcolm could feel the energy, the determination that surged through the air, and he felt a renewed sense of hope. They weren't alone. The city was listening, and they had the power to make a difference. As the rally began to wind down, Malcolm and Maya made their way through the crowd, shaking hands, thanking people for coming, and gathering any additional support they could. Sharon stayed close to Malcolm, her hand still gripping his tightly, her face a mixture of pride and concern. Just as they were about to leave, a loud commotion erupted near the back of the crowd. Malcolm turned, his heart pounding as he saw a group of counter-protesters pushing their way through, shouting insults and waving signs that read, "Support our police and stop the smear campaign." Lieutenant Harper and his officers were suddenly on the move, positioning themselves between the two groups. Malcolm felt his stomach tighten, sensing the danger of the situation. Harper's presence, the shouts, the tension, it all felt like a setup, an attempt to create chaos. "Stay close," he murmured to Sharon, pulling her toward the edge of the crowd. But just as he turned, a counter-protester lunged forward, shoving one of the rally supporters. The crowd erupted into shouts, a few people scrambling to intervene as officers surged forward, trying to contain the commotion. Malcolm watched, helpless, as the peaceful rally threatened to spiral into violence. "Everyone back up," Maya shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "We're here peacefully. Don't let them provoke you." Her words had an effect, and the rally-goers began to pull back, forming a protective barrier around one another. Malcolm watched as people locked arms, a show of unity and defiance in the face of provocation. But Harper's gaze found him again, his expression dark and calculating. Malcolm knew this was exactly what the department wanted: an excuse to shut them down, to paint them as troublemakers. As the police escorted the counter-protesters away, Malcolm felt a surge of relief. But the warning was clear: they would stop at nothing to protect Officer Blake. The department was watching, waiting for them to slip up, to make a mistake. When the crowd finally began to disperse, Malcolm turned to Maya, his voice low. "They're trying to bait us. Harper was here to make sure this escalated." Maya nodded, her face grim. "I know. But we didn't give them what they wanted, and now they're even more desperate." Malcolm looked back at the square, the remnants of the rally still visible in the signs and banners scattered on the ground. Today had been a victory, a show of strength, but he knew the fight was far from over. As they walked back to their cars, Malcolm felt Sharon's hand slip into his, grounding him. She looked up at him, her face a mixture of pride and concern. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "we'll face it together." Malcolm nodded, his heart filled with gratitude and determination. They had taken a stand today, and the city had listened. But he knew that, with each step forward, the threats against them would only grow. The stakes were higher now, but so was his resolve. He would see this through, no matter what it took. For Jordan, for his family, for justice. The sound of a rock shattering glass jolted Malcolm awake. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding as he listened for any other sounds. A second later he heard Sharon gasp beside him, her voice trembling in the dark. "Malcolm, did you hear that?" He nodded, already on his feet, moving toward the hallway where a small light flickered, illuminating the shards of glass scattered across the floor by the front door. He moved cautiously, his heart thudding with every step, until he spotted a brick lying among the broken glass, a scrap of paper tied to it. "Stay back," he said quietly to Sharon, who had followed him. He picked up the brick, the weight of it cold and heavy in his hands. With a sinking feeling, he untied the paper, unfolding it to reveal a crudely scrawled message: "Back off or else." Malcolm felt a rush of anger so intense it made his vision blur. They were threatening his family now, trying to intimidate him into silence. He glanced at Sharon, her face pale as she read the message over his shoulder. "They're trying to scare us, Malcolm," she whispered. What if they actually follow through?" The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. For a long moment, Malcolm just stood there, feeling the hot pulse of rage course through him, every fiber of his being screaming for justice, for revenge. He'd stayed calm for so long, believing that they could do this the right way. But this was too much. "I need to make a call," he muttered, his voice low and tight. "We can't let this go." An hour later, Maya and Leon were at Malcolm's house, examining the brick and the message it had carried. Maya's face was grim as she held the note, carefully slipping it into a plastic bag. "This is an escalation," she said, her tone sharp. "They're getting desperate, Malcolm. They know they're losing control, and they're trying to scare you into backing down." Leon nodded, his face tense. "I've seen tactics like this before. It's intimidation, plain and simple." Malcolm paced the room, fists clenched at his sides. "They can't keep doing this, Maya. They think they can just silence us with threats and fear? I'm done. I've had enough." Sharon, sitting on the couch, looked up at him, her face etched with worry. "Malcolm, please. We need to be smart about this. They want you to react. They want to push you to do something they can use against you." Maya placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "Sharon's right. If you let them get to you, they'll turn it against you in court. We need to stay focused on the trial. That's where we can really hold them accountable." Malcolm took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm brewing inside him. Every instinct he had screamed to take action, to confront Officer Blake, to make him feel a fraction of the pain he had inflicted on Jordan and countless others. But he knew that giving in to that anger would only play into their hands. He looked at Maya and Leon, forcing himself to breathe deeply. "What's our next move?" Maya exchanged a glance with Leon, her expression serious. "We press forward, Malcolm. We don't let them intimidate us. Tomorrow, we're going to meet with our witnesses, solidify their testimonies, and prepare for the trial. This note is evidence now, proof that they're resorting to threats to keep you quiet. Leon nodded. And I'll keep working the media angle. The more public support we have, the harder it will be for them to brush this off. People need to know what's happening. Malcolm felt a spark of hope, faint but present. They had come too far to turn back now. Too many people were depending on them. He looked at Sharon, seeing the fear in her eyes but also the strength. She had stood by him through every step of this journey, despite the risks. "All right," he said, his voice steadier now. "We go forward. For Jordan and for everyone else who's been hurt." The next morning, Malcolm arrived at Maya's office, where a group of witnesses had gathered. Some were familiar faces from the neighborhood, people he had seen in passing but hadn't known well. Others were strangers, individuals who had heard about Jordan's case and wanted to lend their voices to the fight. Mr. Reed was there, standing with a determined expression, and beside him was Tasha, the young woman whose brother had faced harassment from Blake. As Malcolm looked around the room, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. These people were here because they believed in justice, because they believed that what had happened to Jordan and so many others was wrong. Maya addressed the group, her voice calm but powerful. "Thank you all for being here today. Each of you has your own story, your own experience with Officer Blake. By coming forward, you're helping us show the court, the city, and the world that this isn't just an isolated incident." Mr. Reed nodded, his face solemn. "We're here because enough is enough. They can't keep doing this to us, to our children. Jordan's story. It could have been any one of ours." Tasha looked down, her hands clenched tightly. "My brother was so scared after what happened. He didn't want to speak up, didn't want any more trouble. But I know we have to do this for him and for Jordan." Malcolm listened, feeling the weight of their words. This fight wasn't just about his family, it was about a community that had been silenced, bullied, and oppressed. He felt a sense of solidarity in the room, a unity that had been forged through shared pain and determination. After everyone had spoken, Maya outlined the plan for the trial, going over each step of the process, preparing them for what they could expect in court. As she spoke, Malcolm felt a sense of clarity settle over him. The trial was just days away, and they were ready. That evening, as Malcolm returned home, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The threats, the surveillance, the warnings from Harper, they had all made him hyper-aware, his nerves constantly on edge. He glanced over his shoulder as he approached his front door, half expecting to see an unmarked car parked nearby. But the street was quiet, the familiar houses standing silently under the streetlights. Once inside, he locked the door, securing every bolt and latch. Sharon watched him from the living room, her face a mixture of worry and exhaustion. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft. Malcolm nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "Yeah, just a long day." They sat together in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The trial was so close now, the culmination of weeks of pain, fear, and resilience. Malcolm could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But as he looked at Sharon, he felt a spark of strength. She had stood by him through every step of this journey, through every threat, every sleepless night. He took her hand, feeling the warmth and steadiness of her grip. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "I'm glad you're with me." She smiled, a small, weary smile, and leaned her head against his shoulder. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." As they sat together, Malcolm felt the anger, the fear, the uncertainty all melt away, replaced by a quiet resolve. The fight wasn't over and the risks were greater than ever, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that he wouldn't stop until justice was served. For Jordan, for his family, for every person who had been wronged by those who thought they were untouchable. And with Sharon by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. The courthouse was packed, its usual quiet disrupted by the murmur of voices and the presence of supporters and media alike. Malcolm stood just inside the entrance, taking in the sight of the people who had shown up to stand with him. Familiar faces from the neighborhood, families who had gone through similar experiences, and strangers who had heard Jordan's story filled the rows of benches. Maya stood beside him, her expression steely and focused. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, offering a calm but determined nod. "We're ready, Malcolm. We've worked hard to make this case airtight. Let's make them hear us." Malcolm nodded, steeling himself for what lay ahead. This was at the moment they had been building toward. He could feel his heart pounding, a mixture of fear, anger, and determination filling his chest. "Thank you, Maya," he said quietly, "for everything." She offered a small, encouraging smile. "We're in this together, for Jordan and for everyone who's been hurt by men like Blake." They moved to their seats in the courtroom, Malcolm taking a deep breath as he glanced over at the opposing side. Officer Blake sat there, his face carefully blank, dressed in his uniform as though he were the model of respectability. His lawyer, a sharp, composed woman with a confident air, whispered something to him, and Blake's eyes briefly flicked in Malcolm's direction. It was a look that held no remorse, no fear, only arrogance. Malcolm's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was the time for patience, for control. He was here for Jordan, and he would not let Blake's indifference shake his resolve. As the judge entered, everyone stood, the room falling silent. Malcolm felt Sharon's hand slip into his, a comforting presence beside him. They had come so far, and despite the fear that gnawed at him, he felt a sense of strength with her by his side. The trial began with opening statements, Maya stepping forward with a calm authority that filled the room. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "Today we are here not just for justice for Jordan King, but to hold accountable an officer who has betrayed the trust of his badge and his community. Officer Wyatt Blake is not an isolated case. His actions reflect a pattern of abuse, intimidation, and unchecked power. We have witnesses, evidence, and a community standing behind us, and we ask you to listen with open minds to the story of a young man who deserves better." Malcolm watched the jury's faces, noting the way they seemed to lean forward, listening intently. He felt a flicker of hope. Maya had a presence that commanded attention, her words precise and powerful. She wasn't just speaking for him, she was speaking for everyone who had been silenced. Then it was Blake's lawyer's turn. She stepped forward, her tone measured and professional, a stark contrast to the fiery passion of Maya's words. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "we ask you to remember that Officer Blake has served this community honorably for years. He is a decorated officer with a clean record, and he acted within the bounds of the law. The incident involving Mr. King's son was tragic, yes. But Officer Blake's actions were those of a man defending himself in a volatile situation. We ask that you consider the facts and not be swayed by sensationalized accounts or emotional testimony." Malcolm felt his fists tighten in his lap. He could hear the implication in her words, the subtle attempt to paint Jordan as a threat, as a danger. But he forced himself to stay composed. They had expected this, and they were ready. The prosecution began by calling their first witness, a young woman who had been present on the night of the incident. She had seen Blake confront Jordan, had seen the aggression in his stance. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke, but her words were clear. "I saw Officer Blake push Jordan against the car," she testified. "Jordan didn't do anything wrong. He was just trying to get home, and Blake, he looked angry, like he was looking for a fight." Blake's lawyer attempted to discredit her, questioning her memory, suggesting she might have misinterpreted the events. But the witness held firm, her voice gaining strength as she recounted what she had seen. Malcolm felt a surge of gratitude for her courage. It took bravery to stand up against an officer, to risk backlash for telling the truth. And she wasn't the only one. As the morning wore on, witness after witness took the stand, each one adding to the growing portrait of Blake as a man who abused his power. Tasha's testimony was especially powerful, her voice steady as she described the way Blake had harassed her brother, how he had instilled a sense of fear in her family. "People in our neighborhood know Officer Blake," she said, looking directly at the jury. "We know to stay out of his way, to avoid eye contact, because we've seen what he can do when he decides you're a problem." Malcolm watched the jury, noting the way some of them exchanged glances, the way their expressions hardened as they listened. The truth was coming to light, and for the first time, Malcolm felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, justice was within reach. But the defense wasn't done. When Blake's lawyer cross-examined Tasha, she focused on casting doubt, twisting her words, suggesting that perhaps she had a personal vendetta against the police. Tasha held her ground, but Malcolm could see the strain on her face, the weight of the intimidation tactics bearing down on her. Finally, the prosecution called Malcolm himself to the stand. He felt a rush of nerves as he made his way to the front, every eye in the room fixed on him. He had rehearsed his testimony with Maya, had gone over every detail of that terrible night, but sitting here, under the harsh scrutiny of the court, he felt the gravity of the moment. Maya approached him, her face kind but focused. "Mr. King, can you tell the court what happened on the night your son was injured?" Malcolm took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I was at home when I got a call from one of Jordan's friends. They told me that he'd been hurt, that he was being taken to the hospital." His voice wavered, the memory of that night flooding back with a sharp, painful clarity. He swallowed, forcing himself to continue. "When I saw my son in that hospital bed, bruised and broken, I knew something wasn't right. Jordan isn't a violent kid, he doesn't start fights, and I knew he didn't deserve what happened to him." Maya nodded, allowing him a moment to collect himself. "And what was your experience when you tried to report this to the police?" "They didn't listen," Malcolm replied, anger simmering beneath his words. "They tried to paint Jordan as the problem, said he'd resisted arrest, but my son is lying in a hospital bed because of what Officer Blake did, and they're trying to cover it up." Blake's lawyer stepped forward, her face impassive. "Mr. King, are you suggesting that the entire police department is conspiring against your son?" "I'm saying they're protecting one of their own," Malcolm shot back, his voice steady but firm. "And they're willing to do it at any cost." The lawyer raised an eyebrow, her tone cold. "Or perhaps, Mr. King, you're simply too close to this to see things objectively." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, but he didn't take the bait. "I see exactly what's happening here, and so does everyone else in this room." She pursed her lips, turning away as if dismissing him. But Malcolm saw the way the jury watched him, the way his words resonated with them. He had spoken his truth, and no amount of twisting or manipulation could erase that. As he stepped down from the stand, Malcolm felt a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He had said what needed to be said. Now it was in the hands of the court. But as he took his seat beside Sharon, he knew that regardless of the outcome, he had given everything he had for Jordan, for justice, for the truth, and he would see this through to the very end. The next day in court, the air was thick with tension. Malcolm took his seat beside Maya, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Each day of the trial had worn him down, and though he held his head high, he could feel the weight pressing on his shoulders. He glanced at Sharon, who gave him a reassuring nod from the gallery. She was his anchor, her unwavering presence a reminder of why he was here. Today, Maya would present some of the most crucial testimonies, pieces of evidence she hoped would leave no doubt in the jury's mind about Officer Blake's history of misconduct. This was the day they would present their strongest arguments, and Malcolm knew the stakes couldn't be higher. The judge called for order as the jury filed in, their faces set in a mixture of interest and apprehension. Malcolm wondered what they were thinking, what impressions had already taken root in their minds. He could only hope that the truth of Jordan's story had resonated. Maya rose from her seat, her presence commanding as she called Mr. Reed to the stand. Malcolm felt a pang of gratitude as he watched his neighbor make his way forward. He knew it had taken courage for Mr. Reed to testify, to share his own story of mistreatment. "Mr. Reed," Maya began, "can you tell the court about your experience with Officer Blake?" Mr. Reed took a steadying breath, nodding. "Yes, Maya. About a year ago, Officer Blake pulled me over while I was driving home from work. He said I matched the description of a suspect in a burglary, but I hadn't done anything wrong. He questioned me, kept me on the side of the road for over an hour, searching my car, asking me questions, treating me like I was guilty of something." Maya nodded, her expression empathetic. "And did Officer Blake find anything to indicate you were involved in any criminal activity?" "No, ma'am," Mr. Reed replied, his voice clear. "He didn't find anything, because I hadn't done anything. But he kept pushing, kept trying to intimidate me, made me feel like I was less than human." Maya glanced at the jury, letting the weight of Mr. Reed's words settle. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. Your bravery in sharing your story is greatly appreciated." But as Mr. Reed stepped down, Malcolm saw the defense lawyer's face tighten with a predatory gleam. She stood, calling a new witness to the stand, a young officer from Blake's precinct. Malcolm's heart sank, sensing what was coming next. The officer took the stand, his uniform crisp, his demeanor respectful. The defense wasted no time painting Blake as a dedicated and upstanding officer. "Officer Mason," the defense lawyer began, her tone warm, almost friendly, "can you tell us about your experience working with Officer Blake?" "Yes, ma'am," the young officer replied, glancing briefly at the jury. "I've worked alongside Officer Blake for 3 years, and he's always been professional. He's committed to keeping our community safe." The defense nodded, as if they'd been expecting this answer all along. "In your time working with Officer Blake, have you ever seen him act inappropriately? Use excessive force, perhaps?" The officer shook his head firmly. "No, Mom. Officer Blake is fair. He follows procedure and treats people with respect. He's a good cop." Malcolm clenched his fists, frustration boiling within him. He knew this was all a calculated tactic, a way to paint Blake as a misunderstood protector of the community. He could feel the subtle doubt creeping in, the way the jury seemed to shift, as though reconsidering what they'd heard. But Maya was unshaken. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she rose gracefully, her eyes locked on Officer Mason. "Officer Mason, you said you've worked with Officer Blake for 3 years, is that correct?" "Yes, Mom," he replied, his tone steady. "In those 3 years, have you ever directly witnessed an interaction between Officer Blake and any of the individuals who filed complaints against him?" The officer hesitated, shifting slightly in his seat. "No, ma'am." "So, to be clear," Maya continued, her voice calm but firm, "your statement about Officer Blake's behavior is based solely on your own limited observations. You haven't actually seen how he interacts with the people who've accused him of misconduct." Officer Mason's jaw tightened. "That's correct, ma'am." "Thank you, Officer Mason. No further questions." Maya sat back down, her expression unreadable, but Malcolm could see the quiet triumph in her eyes. She had planted a seed of doubt, a small but significant crack in the defense's portrayal of Blake. As Officer Mason stepped down, Malcolm felt a surge of relief. But the defense wasn't finished. They called one of Blake's superiors, a sergeant who praised Blake's record, painting him as a model officer. It was a battle of perceptions, with the defense working to shield Blake under a veil of respectability. By the time the lunch recess was called, Malcolm felt the strain of the morning's testimonies weighing on him. He stepped out of the courthouse to get some fresh air, needing a moment to clear his mind. The crowd of supporters and reporters was still outside, murmuring in low voices as they watched him. Leon approached, placing a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "How's it going in there?" Malcolm shook his head, frustration etched across his face. "They're trying to make him look like a hero, like he's some kind of saint who's being persecuted." Leon nodded grimly. "It's what they do. But people know the truth, Malcolm. They've seen what's happening." "Do they?" Malcolm replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Because sometimes it feels like the truth doesn't matter. Like no matter what we say, they'll believe whatever makes them comfortable." Leon met his gaze, his eyes fierce. "They can't ignore the voices of the people, Malcolm. And you're not alone. This fight isn't just yours anymore." Malcolm took a deep breath, letting Leon's words sink in. He knew his friend was right, but the trial was testing him in ways he hadn't anticipated, pushing him to the edge of despair. When they returned to the courtroom, Maya called Tasha to the stand. The young woman looked nervous but determined, her hands clasped tightly as she began to testify about her brother's encounter with Blake. "Officer Blake pulled my brother over for a broken taillight," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "But instead of just giving him a ticket, he started asking all these questions, treating him like he'd done something worse." Maya encouraged her to continue, guiding her gently. "Did Officer Blake use any force during this encounter?" Tasha nodded, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, when my brother tried to explain that he hadn't done anything, Blake pushed him against the car. Told him he was suspicious and that he'd better be careful. My brother was scared. He was just a kid." The defense lawyer rose, her face carefully controlled. "Miss Fields, is it possible that your brother was acting defensive, maybe even disrespectful, when Officer Blake approached him?" Tasha's face hardened. "No, my brother did nothing wrong. Blake was the one who escalated things. He was looking for a reason to treat him like that." The lawyer tilted her head, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "Perhaps that's just your perception, Ms. Fields. People often interpret situations differently, wouldn't you agree?" Tasha glared back, unflinching. "No, I know what happened." As Tasha stepped down, Malcolm felt a surge of pride and frustration. The defense's tactics were ruthless, twisting every word, every piece of evidence to make Blake appear blameless. But Tasha had held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. By the end of the day, as the court adjourned, Malcolm felt drained, his mind racing with the events of the trial. They had made progress, but the defense's tactics had taken their toll. It felt like a tug of war, each side fighting fiercely, with every small victory balanced by a setback. As he stepped outside with Sharon and Maya, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The road ahead was still long, but they had come too far to give up now. They would keep pushing, keep fighting, until the truth prevailed. And as they left the courthouse, he knew that no matter what happened, he would never stop fighting for Jordan and for the justice his son deserved. The tension in the courtroom had become a nearly tangible force, heavy and unrelenting. Malcolm could feel it in the way people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the way the jury exchanged glances, their expressions inscrutable. Each day in court felt like a battle fought on multiple fronts, and Malcolm was beginning to understand that the courtroom wasn't just a place of justice, it was a theater of strategy and manipulation. Today, Maya had called one of their most crucial witnesses, a former officer named Henry Sullivan, who had worked with Blake years ago. Henry had left the force under contentious circumstances, but he'd reached out to Maya after hearing about Jordan's case. He had information that could turn the tide. Malcolm watched as the retired officer, gray-haired and wearing a tired expression, approached the witness stand. Henry Sullivan was older, with a worn look that spoke of years of service. His eyes held a mixture of regret and determination, and Malcolm sensed that the man had come to right some of the wrongs he'd seen during his time on the force. Maya stood beside the witness stand, her voice calm and reassuring. "Mr. Sullivan, thank you for joining us today. Can you tell the court about your experience working with Officer Blake?" Henry cleared his throat, his voice raspy but steady. "I worked with Blake about 10 years ago. Back then, I was a sergeant. I trained new officers, helped them learn the ropes." He paused, glancing briefly at Blake, who sat with an unreadable expression. But there were always incidents with Blake, times when he seemed to take things a bit too far. Maya nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Can you give us an example?" Henry hesitated, a shadow passing over his face, but he pressed on. "One time, we responded to a domestic disturbance call. When we got there, Blake was aggressive, even though the situation was under control. He ended up roughing up a young man who wasn't even involved. When I asked him why, he just shrugged, said he had a hunch." The courtroom was silent, each word weighing heavily. Malcolm felt a flicker of hope. Henry's testimony painted a picture of Blake's behavior that aligned with everything they had been trying to prove. "Did you report this incident, Mr. Sullivan?" Maya asked, her voice gentle but firm. Henry looked down, guilt etched across his face. "I tried. But the higher-ups, they didn't want to hear it. They said it was a training matter, that I should just keep an eye on him. But over time, I saw more and more of the same from Blake. It was like he thought he could get away with anything." Maya nodded, allowing a moment of silence to let the jury absorb his words. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Your courage in coming forward today is invaluable." Malcolm felt a surge of relief. Sullivan's testimony had the weight of an insider, someone who had seen Blake's behavior firsthand. But as he watched the defense lawyer rise, he felt a prickle of dread. He knew they wouldn't let this stand unchallenged. The defense lawyer approached Sullivan, her tone sharp and calculated. "Mr. Sullivan, you left the police force under less than ideal circumstances, isn't that correct?" Henry's face tightened. "I left because I couldn't stand what I was seeing. I couldn't turn a blind eye anymore." The lawyer smiled, but it was a cold, predatory expression. "And isn't it true that you were under investigation at the time for misconduct?" Henry stiffened, glancing at Maya, then at Malcolm. "Yes, there was an investigation, but it was a setup. They were trying to get rid of me because I refused to keep quiet about what I saw." The lawyer shrugged, feigning indifference. "Or perhaps, Mr. Sullivan, you're simply a disgruntled former officer looking to get revenge on a department that no longer wanted you." Henry clenched his fists, his voice tight. "I'm here because I want to do the right thing. Because people like Blake shouldn't be allowed to wear a badge." The lawyer nodded, her expression cool. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. No further questions." As Henry left the stand, Malcolm felt the flicker of hope dim slightly. The defense had done its job, casting doubt on Sullivan's credibility, turning his words into a matter of personal grievance rather than professional integrity. He glanced at the jury, their faces unreadable, and wondered if they, too, had been swayed. Maya called their next witness, a city official who had reviewed complaints against Blake. She hoped to establish that the department had received numerous complaints about him, most of which had been quietly dismissed. But the defense was relentless, cross-examining each witness with an unwavering determination to dismantle every word, every implication. By the time the afternoon session rolled around, Malcolm felt drained. The defense's tactics were effective. They were creating just enough doubt to cloud the truth, to make it seem as though Jordan's story was just one of many misunderstandings. Maya's last witness for the day was Tasha's brother, a young man named Aaron, who had experienced harassment from Blake firsthand. Aaron's voice shook slightly as he recounted his experience, describing how Blake had pulled him over, searched him without cause, and humiliated him in front of bystanders. "He treated me like I wasn't even human," Aaron said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like I was just some problem he had to deal with." Maya looked at him, her expression filled with empathy. "Thank you, Aaron. Your courage in coming forward means a great deal to us." As Aaron stepped down, Malcolm felt a pang of hope. Aaron's story mirrored Jordan's in so many ways, and he hoped that the jury could see the pattern. But the defense's cross-examination was swift and ruthless, zeroing in on Aaron's shaky voice and nervous demeanor. "Mr. Fields," the defense lawyer said, her tone dripping with disdain, "are you sure you didn't do anything to provoke Officer Blake's response? After all, officers don't simply pull people over for no reason." Aaron looked down, visibly uncomfortable. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to get home." The lawyer smiled, her tone turning mocking. "And yet, here you are, accusing a decorated officer of harassment with nothing but your word." As Aaron left the stand, shoulders slumped, Malcolm felt a wave of anger wash over him. The defense was relentless, twisting every story, every piece of evidence to fit their narrative. He could see the strain on Maya's face, the frustration simmering just below the surface. Outside the courthouse that evening, Malcolm and Maya gathered with their allies, the weight of the day's events pressing down on them. "We're making progress," Maya said, her voice weary but determined. "They're feeling the pressure, or they wouldn't be pushing back so hard." "But are we reaching the jury?" Malcolm asked, his voice edged with frustration. "Every time we make a point, they find a way to tear it down. It feels like we're fighting an uphill battle." Leon, who had joined them, placed a reassuring hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "We're getting through, Malcolm. People are paying attention. The jury is listening. Don't lose faith now." Sharon stepped forward, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. "Malcolm, you've done everything you can. And no matter what happens in that courtroom, you're fighting for Jordan. For all of us." Malcolm looked at her, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. She was right. No matter what the outcome, he had fought with everything he had, refusing to let his son's story be silenced. As they walked away from the courthouse, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of resolve. The trial had been grueling, a test of his patience, his strength, his very belief in justice. But he knew that giving up now wasn't an option. The final days of the trial loomed ahead, and he would face them with unwavering determination, fighting not only for Jordan, but for every person who had been wronged by those who believed themselves untouchable. And as he looked back at the courthouse, its cold facade against the setting sun, he knew that no matter the outcome, he would emerge from this battle changed, carrying forward the torch of justice that his son's story had ignited. The tension in the courtroom was thicker than ever as Officer Blake took the stand, his expression stoic, carefully crafted to convey a sense of professionalism and calm. Malcolm watched him with narrowed eyes, his fists clenched under the table. This was the man who had put his son in the hospital, who had walked away unscathed, shielded by a department that cared more for its own reputation than for justice. Maya stood beside him, her face a mask of determination. She had prepared extensively for this moment, but Malcolm could see the steely intensity in her gaze. This was their chance to show the jury who Blake really was, to strip away the facade he had so carefully constructed. The defense began by guiding Blake through a series of questions, each one designed to paint him as a dedicated officer who had simply been doing his job. He answered in a calm, measured tone, his words carefully chosen. "Officer Blake," the defense lawyer began, "can you tell us about the events of the night in question?" Blake nodded, his voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. I received a call about a potential suspect matching a description we had from an earlier incident. When I saw Jordan King, the first approached him to ask a few questions." The defense nodded, prompting him to continue. "And what happened next?" Blake's gaze flickered briefly to Malcolm, then back to the defense lawyer. "When I approached him, he became agitated. I tried to calm him down, but he was uncooperative, refusing to answer my questions." The words stung, twisting the memory Malcolm had of his son's gentle, respectful nature. He wanted to shout to defend Jordan's character, but he forced himself to remain silent. This was Maya's moment, and he had to trust her. "So you're saying that Jordan King was aggressive toward you?" the defense lawyer pressed. Blake nodded. "Yes, ma'am. He was confrontational, and I felt that he was becoming a threat. At that point, I had to restrain him to ensure both his safety and mine." The defense lawyer turned to the jury, her expression one of feigned regret. "Thank you, Officer Blake. No further questions." Blake's gaze remained calm as he looked at the jury, as if silently reassuring them that he was just a man doing his duty. Malcolm's stomach twisted with frustration, but he clenched his fists, holding back his anger as Maya rose to cross-examine. She approached the stand, her steps slow and deliberate. Her face remained calm, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that told Malcolm she was ready. "Officer Blake," Maya began, her voice smooth but edged with steel. "You stated that Jordan King was aggressive, that he refused to cooperate. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Blake replied, his tone steady. "And you also stated that he matched the description of a suspect from an earlier incident. Can you tell us more about that description?" Blake shifted slightly, his calm demeanor slipping just a fraction. It was a general description. Male, mid-teens, wearing a hoodie. Maya raised an eyebrow, her tone skeptical. "A general description. So would you say that this description could fit numerous young men in the area?" Blake hesitated, his expression tightening. "Well, yes, but..." Maya pressed forward, not letting him finish. "So you approached Jordan King based on a vague description, and, when he didn't respond as you wanted, you felt justified in using force against him. Is that correct?" Blake's face hardened. "I approached him because he seemed suspicious." "Suspicious," Maya repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "And what exactly made him seem suspicious, Officer Blake? Was it his skin color, his clothing, or simply the fact that he didn't submit to your authority without question?" There was a murmur in the courtroom, the tension palpable. Blake's composure was beginning to crack, and Malcolm could see the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Objection," the defense lawyer interjected, her voice sharp. "The prosecutor is making assumptions." "Sustained," the judge replied, but Maya didn't seem fazed. She nodded, taking a step back, but the impact of her question lingered, a seed planted in the minds of the jury. She paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment before she continued. "Officer Blake, you've had multiple complaints filed against you in the past. Isn't that correct?" Blake's face tightened further, and he glanced briefly at his lawyer before answering. "Yes, but those complaints were unsubstantiated." Maya's gaze was unwavering. "So you're telling us that every single complaint was fabricated? That every person who claimed you used excessive force was lying?" Blake hesitated, and Malcolm could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. I can't speak to their motivations, ma'am. All I know is that I was doing my job." Maya leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a quiet intensity. "And what about Jordan King, Officer Blake? Was he just another person you thought you could treat however you wanted, simply because you were wearing a badge?" Blake's jaw clenched, and for the first time, Malcolm saw a flash of anger in his eyes. "No, I acted within the law." Maya didn't relent. "And yet you put him in the hospital. You fractured his wrist, left him bruised and unconscious. Would you say that's within the bounds of your duty, Officer Blake?" Blake shifted, his expression darkening. "I did what I had to do." "And you feel no remorse? No regret for the harm you caused a young man who, as far as we know, did nothing wrong?" Blake's mouth tightened, but he didn't answer. Maya held his gaze, her own expression fierce, unyielding. The silence stretched, thick with tension, and Malcolm could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom fixed on the stand. Finally, Maya turned to the jury, her voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard Officer Blake's testimony. You've seen his lack of accountability, his refusal to acknowledge the pain he caused. And I ask you, do you believe that this is a man who respects the rights of those he's sworn to protect?" The room was silent, the impact of her words lingering. Malcolm could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the jury seemed to lean forward, the faint glimmer of doubt in their eyes as they looked at Blake. As Maya returned to her seat, Blake's lawyer immediately rose, attempting damage control. "Officer Blake, isn't it true that officers must make quick decisions in high-pressure situations? That sometimes, those decisions are made in the interest of safety?" Blake nodded, regaining some of his composure. "Yes, that's correct. I was acting in the interest of public safety." The lawyer nodded as if satisfied and turned back to the jury, attempting to restore their image of Blake as a dedicated officer. No further questions. As Blake stepped down from the stand, Malcolm felt a mixture of anger and hope. Maya had landed some critical blows, exposing Blake's arrogance and lack of remorse, but the defense had managed to cushion the impact, spinning his actions as those of a dutiful officer. The judge called for a recess, and Malcolm felt the weight of exhaustion settle over him as he left the courtroom. Maya joined him outside, her expression tight but hopeful. "You did amazing in there," Malcolm said, gratitude filling his voice. "You made him show his true colors." Maya gave a small, weary smile. "I did what I could. But they're good, Malcolm. They're playing to the jury's sympathies, framing him as a public servant under pressure." Malcolm sighed, glancing back toward the courtroom. "Do you think it's enough to make them see the truth?" Maya placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We've planted doubt, and sometimes that's all it takes. The jury has seen Blake for who he is, even if the defense tries to cover it up. Now we just have to trust that they'll do the right thing." As they stood together in the hallway, Malcolm felt a glimmer of hope, tempered by the uncertainty of the trial's outcome. Blake had been exposed, his facade cracking under Maya's relentless questioning. But the battle was far from over, and Malcolm knew that the final decision was out of his hands. With Sharon by his side, he steeled himself for the days ahead. They had come this far, and he would see this fight through to the end, no matter the cost. For Jordan, for his family, and for every voice that had been silenced. The jury had been in deliberation for hours. Malcolm sat in the courthouse hallway, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. Sharon sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee to steady him, but he could feel the tremor in her fingers as well. Around them, friends, family members, and neighbors sat waiting, their faces a mixture of hope and trepidation. Maya paced near the wall, glancing at her watch every few minutes, a tense look on her face. Leon and a few journalists had gathered just outside, ready to catch the first glimpse of the verdict. It was as if the entire city held its breath, waiting for a decision that would mean so much more than just justice for Jordan. Malcolm felt a strange mix of emotions: hope, fear, anger, and exhaustion, all twisting together until he could barely separate them. He knew they had done everything they could. Maya had fought tirelessly, uncovering every piece of evidence, every testimony. They had shown the jury the truth about Blake, the truth about the system that had protected him. But was it enough? Sharon leaned closer, her voice a whisper. "No matter what happens, Malcolm, I'm so proud of you. You've given everything for Jordan." Malcolm nodded, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. There was a tightness in his chest, a fear that gnawed at him. He had put everything on the line for this fight, and the thought of walking away without justice felt unbearable. But he also knew Sharon was right. They had done everything possible to honor Jordan, to give his story a voice. The door to the jury room opened, and a bailiff stepped out, his expression impassive. "The jury has reached a verdict." The words sent a jolt through Malcolm, and he felt Sharon's hand tighten on his. Maya turned to him, giving him a small, reassuring nod, before they all rose and filed back into the courtroom. Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest as he took his seat, his eyes fixed on the jury box. The jury filed in, their faces serious and unreadable. Malcolm tried to find something, anything, in their expressions that might give him a clue, but their expressions were blank, neutral. He swallowed, his mouth dry as the judge took his seat, calling the court to order. "Will the foreperson please rise and read the verdict?" the judge said, his tone formal. A woman stood, holding a small slip of paper. She looked around the room, her face pale, before she began to speak. "In the case of Officer Wyatt Blake, we the jury find the defendant." The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on her. Guilty of excessive force resulting in grievous bodily harm. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, and Malcolm felt Sharon's hand fly to her mouth in shock. He could barely process the words, a wave of relief and disbelief washing over him. The foreperson continued. "However, we find the defendant not guilty on the charge of civil rights violation due to insufficient evidence." Malcolm's heart sank slightly, but the victory of the first verdict held him steady. Blake had been found guilty. Justice, at least in part, had been served. Blake's face twisted with anger as the judge ordered him to be taken into custody. He shot Malcolm a glare, filled with resentment and fury, but Malcolm met his gaze, unflinching. He had fought for this moment, and he wouldn't let Blake's hatred tarnish it. The judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the trial, and the courtroom erupted into murmurs and whispers. Maya turned to Malcolm, a small, tired smile on her face. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. Malcolm nodded, emotion catching in his throat. "Thank you, Maya, for everything." She placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression softening. "This was your victory too, Malcolm. You gave your son the justice he deserved." As they left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted in cheers, reporters clamoring for interviews, supporters holding signs that read "Justice for Jordan" and "Hold them accountable." Malcolm felt a sense of pride and gratitude as he looked at the people who had stood by him, who had believed in his fight even when the odds were stacked against them. Leon approached, a broad smile on his face. "Malcolm, the city's behind you. This is a victory not just for you, but for everyone who's been hurt by people like Blake." Malcolm nodded, feeling a swell of emotion. "It's a start, Leon. But there's still so much work to do." Leon's expression turned serious. "And I'll be there to report on every step of it." As they made their way through the crowd, Malcolm felt Sharon slip her hand into his, her face radiant with pride. He pulled her close, feeling the weight of the journey they'd taken together, the countless nights of fear and doubt. But they had made it. They had stood their ground, refusing to be silenced. Later that evening, they gathered at a local community center to celebrate. Friends, neighbors, and supporters filled the room, their voices ringing out with laughter and relief. It was a night of joy, a moment to honor Jordan's memory and the victory they had achieved. Malcolm stood at the front of the room, holding a small glass as he addressed the crowd. His voice shook slightly, but he held steady, looking out at the people who had become his family through this fight. "Thank you," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all for standing with us, for believing in Jordan and in the justice he deserved. This victory is as much yours as it is ours." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I fought for my son because he couldn't fight for himself. But I want you all to know that this fight isn't over. There are still so many others who need our voices, who need justice. And I pledge to keep fighting, to keep pushing, until this city is a place where every young person, every family, can feel safe." The crowd erupted into applause, and Malcolm felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of purpose that transcended the pain and anger he had felt for so long. This was about more than just Jordan now. It was about changing the system that had allowed someone like Blake to operate unchecked, about building a future where no one else would have to endure what his family had faced. As the evening wore on, people came up to him, offering words of thanks, sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. Malcolm listened to each one, his heart swelling with a sense of unity and determination. Maya approached him near the end of the night, her expression thoughtful. "Malcolm, I've seen a lot of cases, but this one reminded me why I do this work." He smiled, grateful for her strength and dedication. "We couldn't have done it without you, Maya. You gave us hope when we thought we had none." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "This victory is just the beginning. There's a lot of work to be done, but with people like you leading the way, I believe we can make a difference." As she walked away, Malcolm felt a sense of peace settle over him. The battle had been long, exhausting, but the outcome had been worth every sleepless night, every tear, every moment of doubt. He turned to Sharon, pulling her into a hug as they stood together, feeling the weight of the past months lift from their shoulders. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with pride. "You did it, Malcolm," she whispered. "You gave our son the justice he deserved." Malcolm nodded, his heart full. "We did it, Sharon, and we'll keep doing it. For Jordan. For everyone." As the evening wound down, Malcolm stepped outside, looking up at the stars. He felt a quiet resolve, a sense of purpose that would guide him forward. He knew the fight for justice would continue, but tonight he could finally breathe, finally feel that they had made a difference. And he knew, as he looked up at the night sky, that Jordan's spirit was with him, watching over them, proud of the father who had refused to give up. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over the neighborhood, bathing everything in a golden light that felt almost cleansing. Malcolm sat on the front porch, sipping his coffee, letting the quiet sink in. It was the first truly peaceful moment he'd had in months, and he allowed himself a deep breath, feeling the tension begin to melt from his shoulders. It had been 3 days since the verdict, 3 days of relief, celebration, and a kind of aching exhaustion he hadn't realized he was carrying. His thoughts turned to Jordan, his son who had become a symbol of resilience and justice. The trial might have been over, but Malcolm knew that this was only the beginning of the legacy he wanted to build in Jordan's honor. Sharon stepped out onto the porch, a soft smile on her face as she joined him. She wrapped her arms around him, resting her head on his shoulder. They didn't need to say anything, the quiet shared between them spoke volumes. They had weathered a storm together, and now they were finally emerging on the other side. "You know," Sharon murmured after a while, "I keep thinking about how proud Jordan would be. He always looked up to you, and now he'd be so proud of the man you've become." Malcolm's throat tightened, and he nodded, unable to find the words. Jordan's absence was a void he would carry forever, but knowing they had done everything they could to honor him brought a sense of peace he hadn't thought possible. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for being with me through all of this. I couldn't have done it without you." She squeezed his hand, a warm and steady presence beside him. "We're in this together, Malcolm. Always." Later that morning, Malcolm made his way to the local community center, where a small gathering of neighbors, activists, and supporters was waiting. Maya and Leon were there, along with others who had been with him every step of the journey. The energy in the room was different now, still determined, but with a newfound sense of hope and purpose. He stood in front of the room, feeling the familiar weight of their expectant gazes. This time, though, the pressure felt lighter, buoyed by the unity that had formed in the wake of Jordan's story. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady. "We've come a long way together, and I want to thank each and every one of you for standing by me and my family. Because of you, we found justice for Jordan, and because of you, we've shown this city that our voices cannot be silenced." The crowd responded with quiet nods, murmurs of agreement. He could feel their strength, their resolve, a community that had been galvanized, unwilling to return to the silence that had allowed injustice to thrive. "But I don't want this to be the end," Malcolm continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This fight isn't just about one case, one verdict. It's about creating a future where every child, every family feels safe and respected. I want to make sure that what happened to Jordan never happens to anyone else in our community." Maya stepped forward, a warm smile on her face. "Malcolm and I have been talking about this. We want to establish a foundation in Jordan's name, a resource for families who've been affected by police violence, a place where they can find support, legal resources, and a community that will stand with them." A ripple of approval ran through the crowd, faces lighting up at the idea. Malcolm felt a surge of gratitude for Maya, who had become more than just an attorney. She was a friend, an ally, someone who understood the importance of carrying this work forward. "We'll need all of you," Malcolm said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "This foundation won't just be about my family, it'll be about all of us, about a community that refuses to back down, no matter the odds." Leon raised his hand, a grin on his face. "You know I'll be there, Malcolm. I'll help spread the word, bring more voices into this." The support was immediate, people volunteering their time, their skills, their resources. Malcolm felt a swell of pride as he looked around the room. Jordan's legacy was no longer just a memory, it was something real, something that would continue to grow and impact lives in ways he hadn't imagined. That evening, as the sun began to set, Malcolm found himself at the small park near their house, a place where he and Jordan used to play basketball together. He stood by the court, watching a group of kids laughing, chasing each other, their joy a bittersweet reminder of his son. One of the boys noticed him and waved. "Hey, Mr. King, you here to play?" Malcolm smiled, shaking his head. "Not tonight, but thanks." The boy shrugged, running back to join his friends. Malcolm felt a tug of sorrow, the ache of loss mingling with pride. Jordan would have loved to be here, to be part of this community that had stood up for him. And in a way, Malcolm felt his son's presence here, in every laugh, every shout, every heartbeat of the neighborhood. He took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. He wasn't just Jordan's father, he was now a part of something much larger, a movement, a promise to keep pushing, keep fighting, so that Jordan's story would be more than just a tragedy. As he walked back home, Malcolm's phone buzzed. It was a message from Maya, a simple line that brought a smile to his face. "The city council just approved the foundation's permit. We're officially underway." He typed back, "Thank you, Maya, for everything. Let's make this something Jordan would be proud of." When he arrived home, Sharon was waiting for him on the porch, her face radiant with pride. She'd heard the news from Maya as well, and the two of them sat together, watching as the stars began to appear in the night sky. Sharon said softly, I think Jordan would be happy to know his story has touched so many lives. Malcolm nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He always wanted to help people. I wish he could see this. Sharon took his hand, her voice filled with quiet conviction. He does, Malcolm. He's with us every step of the way. As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, Malcolm felt a peace settle over him, a sense of closure mingled with purpose. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, that there would be more battles to fight, more lives to protect. But he wasn't alone. He had a community behind him, a family that believed in him, and a son whose legacy would live on in every life they touched. For the first time in a long time, Malcolm felt hopeful. He had turned his pain into purpose, his grief into a guiding force that would carry him forward. And as he looked up at the stars, he felt Jordan's presence, a quiet reassurance that he was exactly where he was meant to be. This was just the beginning, and Malcolm was ready.